How does a man stripped of everything, his name, his title, his wife, even the right to be buried under a stone with his family crest, become the unseen ruler of a kingdom that never appeared on any official map? How does the most hated exile in the history of a proud realm end up the one person the king's army turns around and walks away from without firing a single arrow? And how does it happen in 3 years, in a place that for 2 centuries was used as a polite way of saying execution? I am Luna. I am the one who walks through the cracks of stories the official chroniclers were paid to forget. I am the one who reads the margins of the ledgers, the burnt edges of letters, the names crossed out in court records. And tonight, I am going to walk you through one of those cracks. I am going to take you to a swamp at the edge of a kingdom called Vareth, and I am going to show you a man named Dorian Wayland. 3 years before the moment I am about to describe, Dorian Wayland was the youngest royal strategist Vareth had ever crowned. 26 years old, a library in his head, the trust of the king, a wife who actually loved him for reasons that had nothing to do with his title, a daughter who could not yet pronounce his name properly. He stood at the right hand of King Aldrich III in council chambers, where men twice his age had spent their entire lives trying to reach. 3 years before the moment I am about to describe, Dorian Wayland had everything. And now, on a cold gray morning thick with marsh fog, he was standing knee-deep in green water that smelled of rot and old iron. His coat was gone. His ring was gone. His sword was gone. His name had been stripped from the royal registers by order of the High Seal. For 200 years, exile had meant the same thing as execution. The rotten marsh, the Nile bogs, the green tomb. Whatever name you used, the meaning was the same. No one came back. Pause there. Hold that picture in your mind. Because 3 years from this morning, on a hill above this exact spot, an army of 9,000 men carrying the royal banner of Vareth will halt their advance, look down at the city of stone and water that has grown in the marsh, and the general at their head will quietly give the order to turn around. 3 years. From kneeling exile to a kingdom that the king himself cannot touch. I'm going to tell you how. I'm going to show you every step. I'm going to name every name. And by the end of this episode, you will understand why, in certain old taverns along the trade roads of the Eastern Kingdoms, when a merchant raises his cup in the dark and mutters the words Emerald Marsh, the other drinkers go quiet and look at the door. But first, I have to take you back. Because to understand the man standing in that swamp, you have to understand what was taken from him, and you have to understand the morning that broke him in half. It began, as so many of these stories do, with a letter. Dorian had spent 11 years building his position at court. He had started as a clerk in the Hall of Records, sorting tax dispatches and counting grain. He had been noticed at 21 when he reorganized the kingdom's spring levy system in a single winter and saved the treasury an amount of silver that no one in the hall could quite believe was real. He had been promoted 3 times in 18 months. By 24, he sat on the War Council. By 26, he was the king's chief strategist, and the older lords had stopped laughing at him in public, though they had not stopped hating him. The man who hated him the most was a counselor named Mortimer Velasquez. Mortimer Velasquez was 58 years old, a widower, a man with a long jaw and pale eyes that never quite looked at the person he was speaking to. He had served 3 kings. He had survived 2 purges. He owned land in 7 provinces and held private debts on a fourth of the noble houses of Vareth. He believed, with absolute certainty, that the right to advise the throne belonged to men of his bloodline, his age, and his patience, and that the rise of a 26-year-old commoner with quick eyes and quicker arithmetic was an insult to the entire shape of the world. But Mortimer Velasquez was patient. He did not strike at Dorian directly. He waited. He watched. He gathered. And what he gathered over the course of 2 years was a conspiracy. The plan was not original. Plans of this kind rarely are. Mortimer Velasquez had built a quiet alliance with 3 border lords whose lands fed into the southern trade routes. He had promised them tax exemptions, military commissions, and a share of the southern customs once King Aldrich III had been removed. The plan was to use the upcoming summer campaign against the Hollow Hills bandits as cover. The king would ride south. On the 3rd night of the campaign, an arranged ambush by men in bandit colors would kill him. Mortimer Velasque, as the senior counselor in the capital, would step forward to stabilize the throne, install the king's young nephew as a puppet, and rule through him for the next 20 years. It was a clean plan. It was a familiar plan. It was the kind of plan that had worked at least 4 times in the recorded history of Vareth. What Mortimer Velasque did not account for was that Dorian Wayland had been quietly reading the customs ledgers of the southern provinces for 6 months. He had noticed an unusual pattern of grain purchases by minor stewards. He had noticed that the routes those grain shipments followed did not match the supposed destinations. He had noticed that one of those routes passed within a day's ride of the ambush point that had been chosen for the king's summer campaign. Dorian Wayland built a case. Quietly, carefully. In the way a man builds a stone wall, one piece at a time, with everything fitting. He gathered 7 letters, 3 witnesses, 2 financial ledgers, and a sworn statement from a captain of the Southern Road. He bound them together in a single oilcloth wallet. He intended to bring the wallet to the king on the morning of the Autumn Council. The Autumn Council was held on the 8th day of the 9th month. Dorian Wayland left his house at dawn, carrying the wallet under his cloak. He kissed his wife Lenora on the forehead before he left. He told her that by sunset everything would be different. He was right. Everything was different by sunset, just not in the way he had imagined. Because Mortimer Velasque, patient as he was, had not been blind. He had a man inside Dorian's household, a junior steward named Brevin, who had been bought 2 winters before with the promise of a small estate. Brevin had seen the oilcloth wallet. Brevin had told Mortimer, and Mortimer, who had spent 58 years learning that a counterstrike must always be ready before the strike, had prepared. Dorian arrived at the council chamber. He walked through the great doors. He saw the king at the head of the long oak table. He saw the lords standing in their formal places. He saw Mortimer Velasque standing to the right of the throne, calm, pale, his long jaw set. Dorian opened his cloak. He reached for the wallet. The wallet was not there. In its place was a different wallet. A wallet of identical oilcloth, identical binding, identical weight. A wallet that had been switched during the carriage ride by a coachman who had been replaced at the last stable change. A wallet that contained, instead of 7 letters proving Mortimer's treason, 7 letters in Dorian's own forged handwriting, addressed to the southern lords, promising them favors after the king's death. Mortimer Velasque stepped forward before Dorian could speak. He bowed to the king. He said, with the trembling voice of a loyal old servant who had discovered something terrible, that he had reason to believe the chief strategist had been corresponding with traitors. He asked, with apparent reluctance, that Dorian be searched. Dorian was searched. The wallet was found. The letters were read aloud. The king's face did not change. The king's face never changed. Aldrich III was a man of granite habits and slow decisions. But his eyes, which had rested on Dorian Wayland with affection for 5 years, went flat and cold in the time it took to read a single page. Dorian tried to speak. Dorian tried to explain. He spoke about the customs ledgers. He spoke about the grain shipments. He spoke about the captain of the Southern Road. He named names. He named places. He named dates. No one listened. The forged letters were already on the table. Mortimer Velasque was already weeping the careful, controlled tears of a man who had served 3 kings and now had to deliver terrible news to the 4th. 2 of the border lords whose names Dorian had brought to expose were sitting in the chamber, and they wore expressions of polite horror, as if the betrayal Dorian had described were not their own. Dorian Wayland was arrested in the council chamber. He was dragged out by 2 guards who had eaten at his table the previous winter. He was thrown into a cell beneath the palace. The cell was cold. The cell was small. The cell smelled of old straw and older fear. He sat on the stone floor and tried to think. And for the first time in his adult life, his mind was found did not obey him. He tried to list the names of the southern lords. He could not remember the 3rd one. He tried to recall the date on the 2nd customs ledger. The numbers slid sideways in his head. He tried to plan the next move, the next argument, the next letter, and every plan collapsed before it was finished, because every plan required a future. And Dorian Wayland, sitting on that cold stone floor, did not have a future anymore. He had one night. The trial was scheduled for the next morning. Trials of this kind in Vareth were not trials, they were ceremonies. The verdict had already been written. The only question that remained was the sentence. And the sentence, when it came, was the sentence Mortimer Velasque had been waiting 11 years to deliver. The king, who had once embraced Dorian Wayland as the brightest mind of his reign, did not look at him during the reading. The king looked at the floor. The king's hands rested on the arms of the throne and did not move. The chief herald read the charges in a flat voice. Conspiracy against the crown. Forgery of royal seals. Correspondence with foreign agents. Plotting the murder of the king. Each charge was followed by a silence, and in each silence Dorian opened his mouth, and in each silence the herald continued before he could speak. The sentence had 3 parts. The first part was the stripping of name and title. Dorian Wayland would no longer be called Dorian Wayland. He would no longer be of the House of Wayland. He would no longer appear in any registry, any tax roll, any military list, any chronicle. The name would be cut out of every document, and the documents would be rebound. In the official memory of Vareth, he would simply stop having existed from a certain Tuesday in autumn. The second part was the punishment of his wife. Lenora Wayland was 28 years old. She had been born in a small mountain town. She had married Dorian 3 years before, against the wishes of her family, because she believed that intelligence and kindness in one man was a rarer pairing than gold and iron. She had taught herself to read at 16 by stealing the schoolmaster's books from the back of the church. She had a habit of laughing at her own jokes a half second before she finished them. She was, by every account I have been able to find, a person who deserved an old age in a garden. The sentence said she was complicit. The sentence said she had known. The sentence said she would be executed on the public square 3 days from the trial by the standard method in front of whatever crowd chose to come. When the herald read this part, Dorian did not speak. Dorian did not move. Something in his face went still, and the stillness was not calm. The stillness was the kind of stillness that exists in a room 1 second before a window shatters. The third part of the sentence was exile to the rotten marsh. The chief herald rolled up the parchment. The king stood. The king walked out of the chamber without looking at Dorian. Mortimer Velasque stood by the throne with his hands folded, his pale eyes fixed on a spot on the far wall. And on his thin mouth there was something that, if you were watching closely, could have been the smallest, most carefully controlled smile in the history of the kingdom. 3 days later, Lenora Wayland was led onto the public square of the capital. I have read 4 separate accounts of that morning. 2 are official, 2 are the private letters of merchants who happened to be in the city that week and wrote home about what they saw. The accounts do not agree on the weather, they do not agree on the number of people in the square, they do not agree on what Lenora wore, but they agree on 3 things. And those 3 things are what I am going to tell you now, because those 3 things are what broke Dorian Wayland and, 3 years later, made the king's army turn around. The first thing all 4 accounts agree on is that the square was full. Not half full, not crowded only on the side closest to the platform. Full. Some accounts say 4,000 people, some say 6. The square of Vareth could hold, by the old measure, about 5,000 standing. It was full. The second thing all 4 accounts agree on is that the square was silent. There were no shouts, there were no insults thrown at the woman on the platform. There were no cheers when the captain of the guard read the sentence one more time, for the public record. There were no drums. There was only the sound of the wind moving across the stone, and the sound of a single dog barking somewhere far behind the Baker Street, and the sound of Lenora Wayland walking up the wooden steps without being pushed. The third thing all 4 accounts agree on is that no one spoke. There were people in that square who had eaten at Dorian Wayland's table. There were people who had been saved from ruin by his tax reform. There were merchants whose caravans had been protected by his border treaty. There were 3 minor lords who owed him their commissions. There was a baker on the south side of the square whose son Dorian had personally recommended to the Royal Academy 2 winters before. There was a captain of the city watch whose daughter had been treated by Lenora Wayland during a fever the year before, free of charge on a cold night when no other healer would come. Any one of those people could have shouted. Any one of those people could have stepped forward. Any one of those people could have said the word that, by old Verith law, would have required the magistrate to pause the execution for a single day of additional review. One word, one voice, from any one of them. No one spoke. Dorian Wayland was on the square. He had been brought in chains, dressed in a rough gray tunic, his head uncovered, his wrists raw. He had been placed on a low platform off to the side, where the law required the condemned exile to witness the punishment of the family member who shared the guilt. 2 soldiers stood behind him. A third stood in front of him with a long pole so that he could not move toward the main platform. He looked at Lenora. Lenora looked at him. She did not cry. She did not call out to him. She did not curse the king. She did not curse Mortimer Velasque. She did one thing, and one thing only, and the merchant from the Southern Road who wrote home about it that evening wrote it in a single line, underlined twice in his letter. She smiled at her husband. Small, tired, real. As if she were apologizing for going on a journey he could not yet come on. Then she turned to face the executioner. The axe fell. The square stayed silent. 4,000 people, or 6,000 people, depending on which account you trust, watched a young woman die for a crime she had not committed, and not one of them said a word. And Dorian Wayland, on his low platform, did not scream, did not weep, did not collapse. He stood there in his rough gray tunic with his raw wrists, and he looked at the silent crowd. He looked from face to face. He looked at the baker. He looked at the captain of the city watch. He looked at the 3 minor lords. He looked at every single face he recognized, slowly, one after another. And the merchant from the Southern Road wrote in his letter that the look on the exile's face was not the look of a man begging for help. It was the look of a man making a list. They put him on a cart that same afternoon. The cart went east for 4 days. The road got worse. The villages got smaller. By the 3rd day, there were no villages, only abandoned watchtowers and the kind of crossroads that do not appear on any merchant's map. By the 4th day, the road ended, and the ground began to soften, and the air began to smell of iron and rot. On the morning of the 5th day, the cart stopped at the edge of the Rotten Marsh. The Rotten Marsh, in case you have not encountered the name in older chronicles, was not technically part of any kingdom. It sat in a low basin between 3 borders, fed by 2 slow rivers that had no proper outlet, and it had been used by the kings of Verith and the queens of the neighboring realm of Halsenmark and the petty lords of the southern principalities as a dumping ground for unwanted bodies for the better part of 2 centuries. Not literally. The bodies walked in on their own feet. They did not walk out. The marsh had its own ecology of failure. The water was green. The trees were gray. There were biting flies in the warm months and freezing fog in the cold months. There were creatures in the deeper pools that the old maps drew as serpents, but that no one had actually seen and survived to describe. There were 3 or 4 small dry islands of solid ground scattered through the marsh, but those islands were known to be claimed by groups of earlier exiles who had survived long enough to become something worse than what had sent them in. The 2 soldiers who had driven the cart unlocked Dorian's chains. They did not look at him. They were not cruel men. They were tired men doing a job they did not like. One of them said in a flat voice that he was sorry. The other one did not say anything at all. They cut the chains, they threw the cut chains into the mud, they turned the cart around, they drove away. Dorian Wayland stood at the edge of the rotten marsh. He did not move for a long time. The sun came up. The fog began to lift. Somewhere in the marsh, a bird made a sound that did not belong to any bird he had ever heard. He thought about walking back. He thought about following the road. He knew, with the clean, clear certainty of a man who had spent his career calculating odds, that he would be hunted down within 2 days if he tried. The royal warrant was specific. Exile to the Rotten Marsh meant remaining in the Rotten Marsh. To leave the marsh was to invite the bounty hunters who would not bring him back alive. He thought about lying down in the green water and letting it take him. That too would have been a clean calculation. The marsh would do the work. No one would know, no one would care. He did not lie down. The merchant from the Southern Road had written that the look on Dorian Wayland's face on the public square had been the look of a man making a list. The list, on that morning at the edge of the marsh, had 2 columns. The first column was the names of the people who had killed his wife, Mortimer Velasque, the 3 border lords, the forged coachman, the steward named Brevin, the king who had not looked at him. The second column was the names of the people who had watched her die and said nothing. That column was longer. That column had 4,000 names, or 6,000, depending on which account you trust. Dorian Wayland did not have a future that morning, but he had a list, and a list, for a certain kind of mind, is enough. He walked into the marsh. I want to slow down here because the next part of the story is the part the chroniclers got wrong, and it is the part that matters most. The chroniclers who, decades later, wrote about the rise of the Emerald Marsh always describe what happened next as a discovery, as if Dorian Wayland, on the 3rd day of his exile, simply stumbled into the ruined tower and the artifact that would change him. As if it were luck, as if the marsh had given him a gift. It was not a gift, it was not luck, and it was not a stumble. For the first 2 days, Dorian Wayland did exactly what his mind had been trained for 11 years to do. He gathered information. He moved slowly. He noted the direction of the currents. He noted which patches of moss grew on the north side of which trees. He noted the position of the sun at 3 different times of day. He noted the sounds that came from deeper in the marsh at night, and he made a rough mental map of which sounds came from which direction. He drank from water that he had first watched a frog drink from for a quarter of an hour. He ate 1 handful of pale berries, only after he had crushed a single berry against the inside of his wrist and waited 2 hours to see whether his skin reddened. By the end of the 2nd day, he had not moved more than a quarter mile from the edge of the marsh, but he knew, in the rough and provisional way that a mind like his could know anything in a place like that, where the dry ground was, where the deeper pools were, and where, behind a thick curtain of gray willows, the ground rose slightly to form one of the small islands of solid land that the old maps had warned about. He went toward the island, slowly. On the morning of the 3rd day, because of all the calculations he had made in 2 days, only one mattered. A man alone in the rotten marsh would not survive the first cold night. A man on solid ground might survive several, and a man on solid ground with a roof of any kind might survive long enough to do the thing the list required. He reached the island just before midday. The island was small, perhaps 80 paces across. The ground was firm. There were 3 willows on it, and 1 ancient stone foundation, half swallowed by ivy and moss. The foundation was older than Verith, older than the kingdoms that had used the marsh as a dumping ground, older than the maps that had drawn the marsh as a blank. The stones were cut in a style Dorian had seen only once, in a single illustration in a single book in the royal library, in a chapter on the pre-kingdom civilizations whose names had been lost. In the center of the foundation, half buried in moss, there was an opening, a narrow stone staircase going down. Dorian Wayland sat on the edge of the foundation for almost an hour. He did not go down immediately. He looked at the opening. He listened. He smelled the air coming up from it. The air was dry. The air did not smell of rot. The air smelled of stone and of dust and of something faintly metallic that he could not name. He had no torch. He had no rope. He had no weapon. He was a starving man in a gray tunic with raw wrists and a list in his head. He went down anyway. Because the list required a future, and a future required survival, and survival in the marsh required a roof, and the only roof in the marsh was below those stairs. The stairs went down 22 steps. He counted. He always counted. At the bottom of the stairs there was a circular chamber. The chamber was perhaps 15 paces across. The walls were the same pre-kingdom stone as the foundation above. The chamber was completely dry, which, given that it was 22 steps below the waterline of a swamp, was the first impossibility of the day. In the center of the chamber, on a low stone pedestal, there was a circlet. The circlet was not a crown in the sense that a king wears a crown. It was not gold, it was not jeweled. It was a thin band of pale silvery metal, with no visible seam, with 12 small indentations spaced evenly around it, and with faint lines of cyan light running along its inner edge in patterns that did not stay still. The patterns moved, slowly, as if the circlet were thinking. Dorian Wayland stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the circlet for a long time. He did not believe in magic. He had spent his entire career arguing that what the common folk called magic was always, on close inspection, either deception or chemistry or geometry, that the deceiver understood and the audience did not. He had won 3 court debates on this point. He had written a small book on it that the Royal Academy had refused to publish because it was, in their words, unhelpfully correct. He looked at the circlet, an hallucination brought on by hunger and the unfamiliar berries he had eaten the night before, and that in a few hours he would wake up in the mud outside the foundation with nothing in his hands. The second possibility was that this was a real object made by a craft he did not understand, and that touching it would kill him. The third possibility was that this was a real object made by a craft he did not understand, and that touching it would not kill him. In 2 of the 3 possibilities, his future ended at the moment of contact. In one of them, it did not. But all 3 possibilities ended his current state. And his current state was the state of a man who had been stripped of everything, and whose wife had been killed in front of a silent crowd, and who had a list in his head that no current state could ever satisfy. He walked to the pedestal. He picked up the circlet. He placed it on his head. The pattern at the bottom of the marsh, in that dry chamber under 22 stone steps, did not flash. It did not flare. It did not announce itself. The circlet simply settled on his head as if it had been measured for him 1,000 years before, and the faint lines of cyan light, which had been moving slowly, began to move faster. And then, inside Dorian Wayland's mind, a voice that was not a voice said one sentence. Intelligent system attuned. Host recognized. Processing speed multiplier engaged. Prediction depth unlocked. He did not understand the words. He understood the feeling. The feeling was as if a room he had been living in his entire life, lit by a single candle, had suddenly been opened to the sky. He could see further. He could see deeper. He could see all at once every variable he had ever tracked in his career, and every variable he had ever wished he could track, and every connection between them laid out in front of him like a perfectly indexed library that he had never been allowed to enter. He sat down on the floor of the chamber. He had to. His legs would not hold him. The first thought he had sitting on that floor was not a thought about revenge. The first thought he had was a calculation about the marsh. He sat in the dry chamber, and his newly accelerated mind began to do, in the space of about 90 seconds, the work that would have taken his old mind 6 months. It mapped the rough geography he had observed in 2 days. It cross-referenced the position of the sun, the direction of the currents, the placement of the dry islands, the sounds at night. It built a model. The model was crude because it had only 2 days of data, but the model was a model, and the model said something very specific. The model said that the rotten marsh, contrary to 200 years of received opinion, was not a death trap. The model said that the rotten marsh was a defensible position. It had 3 natural choke points where the slow rivers entered the basin. It had at least 7 small islands of solid ground scattered across it, of which one, the one he was currently sitting beneath, was almost perfectly central. It had a supply of water that was undrinkable in its current form, but according to the chemical principles Dorian had spent his career studying, would be entirely drinkable after a properly designed filtration through layered sand, charcoal, and crushed marsh reed. It had biting flies, yes, but the same flies, the model noted, were repelled by the smoke of a particular gray moss that grew on every 3rd willow in the marsh. It had cold fog, yes, but the same fog, the model noted, would render any approaching army effectively blind for the first 3 hours of every morning. It had creatures in the deeper pools, yes, but the same creatures, the model noted, with the patient confidence of a system that did not need to be polite to its host, were almost certainly territorial, which meant they could be mapped, and once mapped, avoided, and once avoided, used. Dorian Wayland sat on the dry stone floor of a chamber that should not have existed, under 22 steps, beneath a swamp that had killed every previous exile for 2 centuries, with a circlet of pale silvery metal on his head, and a mind that suddenly moved at a speed he did not yet understand. And he began, very quietly, to laugh. The laugh was not the laugh of a man who had been broken. The laugh was the laugh of a man who had just realized, with the clean, clear certainty he had always trusted in himself, that the kingdom of Vareth had made exactly one mistake in the entire elaborate punishment they had constructed for him. They had given him a place. They had given him time. And they had assumed, because every exile before him had assumed, that a place and time without resources was the same thing as a place and time without future. It was not. Not for a mind like his. Not anymore. He stood up. He climbed the 22 stairs. He came out onto the small island under the midday sun. He looked at the marsh. The marsh looked, to his new eyes, like a blank page on which he had just been given permission to write whatever he wanted. He said one sentence out loud, to no one, with the same flat voice that had once read tax reports in the Royal Council. The merchant from the Southern Road never heard it, because the merchant from the Southern Road was 400 miles away by that point. But 2.5 years later, when a former Hierojoan named Cassia Marrow wrote her private memoir of the founding years of the Emerald Marsh, she included this sentence as the only thing Dorian Wayland had ever told her about the day he came up from the chamber under the stones. He had said, "Good, now I have somewhere to build." The story of what he built and how, and the night the king's army came and turned around, and the morning Mortimer Velasque was brought to him in chains, is the second half of this episode. We will get there. I promise you we will get there. And I promise you that every step of it is more interesting than the one before. But before I take you to the founding of the Emerald Marsh, I have to take you to the first stranger who walked onto Dorian Wayland's island. Because the rise of an empire is never one mind alone. The system in his head could model 20 steps ahead. The system in his head could not, on its own, lift a stone or plant a reed. For that, he needed hands. And the first pair of hands that came to him belonged to a woman who had also been thrown into the rotten marsh to die 3 months before he had been, and who had survived in a way that even his new mind could not at first explain. Her name was Cassia Marrow. She was 34 years old. She had been the chief surgeon of the second largest hospital in the capital of Vareth, and she had been exiled by a sentence that had been read by the same chief herald in the same flat voice, for the crime of saving a life that the law had decided should not be saved. I will tell you her story, and I will tell you how she found Dorian, and I will tell you what the two of them did in the first 6 months in the next part of this episode. Stay with me. We are about to build a kingdom out of mud and patience.